This case takes place in Hampshire, England on the July 17, 2022. Shay Groves was a 27-year-old woman who lived in Haven, a town in the south of England. She was a mother of one, although was not with the father. She had a boyfriend named Frankie Fitzgerald. Frankie was a 25-year-old man from Portsmouth, and he was a father too. She was described as a rather manipulative woman. Her friends would let her say that she would do whatever it took to get her own way, even if that meant blackmailing someone. On one occasion, she had even told Frankie and some of her friends that she had cancer. This was a lie and had claimed this to garner sympathy and control over people. Shay had somewhat of an obsession with Frankie, and the main reason for this was because of their bedroom life. Both Frankie and Shay would engage in bondage, dominance, submission, and masochism. They would engage in something called knife play, where Frankie would hold blades to Shay's throat. The two had a very off and on relationship. They were both extremely jealous and paranoid about each other cheating. The couple's relationship seemed to be coming to an end. Frankie, in particular, was becoming sick of Shay's manipulative behavior, and she was paranoid that he was going to go back to his ex-girlfriend, something that she often spoke about to her friends. The two were also known to drink heavily and take illegal substances. And on the July 16, 2022, the two had consumed a fair amount. On the July 17, 2022, the police received a rather strange call from a woman named Vicky Baytep. Vicky told the operators that she had just had a FaceTime conversation with a friend of hers named Shay Groves. Vicky stated that the call began with the two of them speaking about their plans for the weekend. But during this call, Vicky overheard Shay's housemate, Lauren White, say, "Are you going to tell her?" Shay then explained that she had a really big secret and begged Vicky not to say anything to anyone. Confused, Vicky stayed on the first time with Shay as she began walking up the stairs and into her bedroom. She pointed the camera at the bed, showing Vicky the dead body of her boyfriend, Frankie. As she pointed the camera to Frankie's body, she said, "I've done him in," and then began to laugh. Her pillow was covering Frankie's face and a number of bin bags were underneath his body. Vicky was deeply disturbed, but the situation was so strange and the camera wasn't close enough to see. She assumed it must have been some kind of sick prank. Vicky asked Shay, "Are you having me on?" But then Shay moved the camera closer and closer and showed a deep cut across Frankie's throat. Vicky would later say, "I don't think I really grasped what happened earlier. The gash was so deep. It was enormous." Shay told Vicky that Frankie had forced himself upon her and that she was a victim of a non-consensual act. To prove this, Shay sent 3 video clips as proof. This proof that Frankie had attacked Shay will be explained later as there is much more to the story. She then asked Vicky, "We're still friends, aren't we?" before ending the call. Following this call, Vicky immediately called the police, explained the FaceTime that she had just had with Shay, and told them where she lived. Officers were dispatched to the house and were met with a strong smell of bleach. The initial interaction with the police was captured by an officer's body camera. "I shall now play you that clip. What's going on?" "Sorry. Your dog's going." "No, no, no. Don't close the door." "What's going on?" "What's going on?" "Who's what?" "Are you Shay?" "I am Shay." "All right. I had some kind of strange, interesting call about somebody having had their throat slit." "Okay. So what's going on here?" "No, that's my dog's." "Yeah. You're under arrest on suspicion of murder. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm me defensively. You do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given evidence. The necessity for your arrest for a positive investigation." "Okay." You can see from the footage that she seems to be oddly relaxed. Shay goes on to tell the police that she didn't know what happened and said, "He's dead. He's in my room and it's a mess. The knife I used is in the sink." Shay was arrested and charged with murder. Shay's flatmate, Lauren White, was initially arrested on suspicion of murder too, but was released on bail. She was, however, charged for failing to give investigating police officers the PIN to her mobile phone. A post-mortem was conducted on Frankie's body. They found that he had been stabbed 17 times to the front of the chest, twice to the other chest areas, and 3 times to the neck. He suffered multiple perforations to the heart and lungs and had lost a catastrophic amount of blood. When the police examined home, they discovered that she seemed to have an intense obsession with serial killers, but not in the usual way where people just find them interesting and watch documentaries. She had a number of framed portraits of notorious killers, including Ted Bundy, Myra Hindley, the Mars murderers, and Jeffrey Dahmer, and had displayed these on her bedroom wall. The police asked Shay to explain exactly what happened. She claimed that she was in fear for her life, that Frankie had attempted to hurt her, and she said she acted in self-defense. She said that the two had a very on and off relationship filled with arguments and that the two would always film their bedroom activities. She claimed that she had footage of Frankie forcing himself on her and attacking her, and that because of this, she needed to defend herself. The police dug a little bit deeper into this. They found her claims to be false. The two had a very extreme sex life, and the footage always seemed to be on the cusp of unconsensual. However, Shay would tell Frankie that she wanted it a certain way and would then edit the videos in a way to seem like he had acted in a non-consensual manner. The police found the unedited video. In this video, the two talked about a safe word and had engaged in knife play and role play. When the videos were edited, it seemed that Frankie had done what Shay had claimed, but she had obviously manipulated the situation. When confronted with this evidence, Shay eventually admitted that she lied about this story, and the trial would begin in February of 2023. The prosecutor showed how Shay had a deep fascination with serial killers and murder documentaries, and showed the many portraits on her wall, and went on to say, this meant that Shay was familiar with what to do and say to try and engineer a situation where she could look like a victim, which of course, completely unraveled in the face of the evidence collected from key witnesses, mobile phones, call data, and recordings. It also came out that Shay had blackmailed another boyfriend with an intimate tape. She had threatened to show the video to his new girlfriend if he didn't do what she wanted, and what Shay wanted was a lift into the town center. In Shay's eyes, this was enough of a reason to blackmail an ex-partner. Shay had also attacked her housemate Lauren a number of times. On one occasion, she attacked her with a pair of nail clippers and split her head open. The court also heard how Shay had lied about the reason for killing Frankie and presented evidence which proved that she was lying with the recordings. They also showed how she had began to clean up the crime scene and tried to get away with the murder. It was then time for Shay to present her defense. She said that the two were extremely paranoid and claimed that on the night of the murder, they had both accused each other of talking to their ex-partners. This was backed up by text messages sent by the both of them. With these suspicions, the two swapped phones and checked each other's messages. Shay claimed that while she was looking through Frankie's phone, she discovered messages from a 13-year-old girl. Shay then said, at that point, I called him some really horrible names like the P word. Frankie then became really angry and his demeanor changed. Shay went on to say you could see it in his eyes. He grabbed me by the throat and forcibly pushed my head towards the headboard. I couldn't breathe and I couldn't even scream. My eyes were blurry. I realized that he wasn't going to let go, and I feared for my life. I reached out and grabbed an object on the bookcase and hit him in the throat. Shay explained that she had a money box next to her bed and that she thought she had hit him with that, but claimed that she had accidentally picked up a knife by mistake and slashed his throat. Shay continued to say he rolled off and he stood up and slid down the wall really slowly. There was bubbling coming out of his neck when he stopped moving, and I was in shock. His chest wasn't moving. It was just a noise. When that happened, I realized that I had killed him. I tried to stop the bubbling and I put my hand there, but it didn't do anything. So I picked up the knife again and stabbed him in the heart. It was at this point that Shay claimed to have panicked and made a call to her daughter's father, who allegedly told her to clean up the crime scene. Shay then told Lauren that she wanted to bury the body in the garden or make it look like Frankie had taken his own life. Shay and Lauren placed bin bags and shopping bags underneath his body and placed a pillow over his face. Shay then warned her that she was an accomplice who had helped place bin bags underneath his body. It was backed up in court that Frankie did have a history of domestic violence. He had been convicted of harming his previous partner before meeting Shay. The woman Shay FaceTimed after the murder, Vicky, admitted that she and Shay would often talk about ways that they could harm Frankie, such as arranging for people to beat him up. Vicky claimed that she didn't think Shay was being serious and thought these conversations were a joke. The prosecution team highlighted that this showed some signs of premeditation. The prosecution rejected claims that the murder was a crime of passion and stated, "She stabbed her boyfriend in a jealous frenzy and then set about trying to cover for herself. Her actions were cold, callous, and calculated. She spun a web of lies, and everything she did was an attempt to further manipulate the situation and detract from taking any responsibility for her crime." The prosecution team also highlighted that there were no defensive injuries on Frankie's body, which shows that no struggle took place, suggesting strongly that she killed him in his sleep. It was also found that Frankie had blocked the girl who had messaged him prior to the murder. The judge also confirmed that the girl was 17 years old and not 13. Police also uncovered that Shay had been sleeping with her former boyfriend, which was filmed. Frankie would go over to Shay's house after, totally unaware that her ex had been over too. After Shay and Frankie would finish being intimate, the judge overseeing the case stated what they thought happened. They went into graphic detail about the things Frankie and Shay would get up to in their bedroom and how violent and borderline non-consensual it could be. The judge said, "This was a crime of passion. You loved the man you killed and you killed the man you loved. You are, as the Crown submitted, manipulative, jealous, and possessive. A crime of passion is not committed in cold blood. You realized your relationship with Frankie was ending, and you were losing your influence over him. You sensed that he was going to leave you for a less toxic girlfriend. You were planning for that already, considering resuming your relationship with your ex-partner. But then, you became furious on finding the messages between Frankie and the supposed 13-year-old girl. You lost your temper and acted upon your impulses. If you could not have Frankie, no one could. No other woman could have him, if not you." The judge highlighted some mitigating factors. They didn't believe the murder was premeditated and also brought up the fact that Shay had a troubled upbringing. She suffered from mental health problems from an early age and suffers from emotionally unstable personality disorder and with complex post-traumatic stress disorder from a previous relationship. She was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 23 years. It said that she showed little to no remorse for what she had done to Frankie. I'm unsure if Shay's housemate, Lauren White, was given a sentence. It's written in court documents that Lauren didn't have many friends and was used as a domestic servant by Shay. She would make her get her clothes ready, put on her socks, make her food and cups of coffee, and as I said before, was violent towards her and parts of her body were eaten. This case takes place in the United States of America on the September 11, 2014. Was a 46-year-old woman who lived in Jeffersonville, Indiana. In 2014, Tammy began a relationship with a man named Joseph Oberhansley. She would later say that at first the relationship was going well. But after just a few weeks, Joseph began to change. Joseph had a rather dark past. Tammy was aware that he had been incarcerated for a crime that he committed, but she did not know the full ins and outs of exactly what happened. Most of the time, he would brush off the reason for his prison time, but the reason was incredibly sinister. In 1998, when Joseph was 18, he was dating a 17-year-old named Sabrina. The two had a child together, although Joseph was under the impression that she had cheated and the child wasn't his. On the December 9, 1998, only days after the birth of their child, Sabrina went over to Joseph's mother's house to visit without him. On this day, Joseph had taken a large amount of illegal substances and made his way over to his mother's house. Upon entering, he was enraged to see Sabrina standing there. In response, Joseph pulled out a gun and fired. He shot Sabrina as she held their child. Joseph's mother then jumped in front of Sabrina and the child, but Joseph opened fire on her too and shot a bullet in her back. Joseph then turned and fired a shot at his sister who was also present. But thankfully, the bullet missed her. After shooting his girlfriend and his own mother, Joseph turned the weapon on himself. He placed it under his chin and fired. Sabrina tragically died from her injury. The baby, however, did manage to survive along with Joseph's mother. She was treated for her injuries and was able to make a recovery. The bullet that Joseph had fired into his own head became lodged in his brain, and he too was able to make a recovery. Once he recovered, he was charged with murder and attempted murder. At the trial, Joseph's defense team argued that he wasn't guilty of murder. His father and brother had recently passed away, and he had turned to alcohol and other substances to cope. They argued that these circumstances had caused a great deal of stress in his life, and that because of this, the crime should be seen as manslaughter instead. The defense team was successful, and Joseph was found guilty of manslaughter in the year February. In July of 2012, after serving 12 years, Joseph was released from prison on parole. Joseph headed for Indiana to join his mother, who forgave him shortly after he had shot her. During his time in prison, she even advocated for his release. However, it wouldn't take too long for Joseph to commit another crime. Whilst on parole in 2013, Joseph went to a bar. Whilst drinking, he got into a fight with a fellow patron and ended up choking this man out. Multiple sources have claimed that he resisted arrest and was even naked during this attack. Despite his previous conviction, Joseph was allowed to be released on bail. And because he was released on bail, he met Tammy. So now we arrive back to 2014. As I said earlier, Joseph and Tammy were in a relationship. But shortly into this relationship, Joseph began to change. He became controlling and aggressive. But then, Tammy confided with a friend and told this friend that Joseph had done something truly horrific. On the September 5th, Joseph held her captive in her home and repeatedly forced himself upon her for 2 days. Because she was so scared of Joseph, she did what he wanted as to not anger him further. This occurred around 4 months into their relationship. Once she was away from Joseph after being held captive, she ended the relationship. But Joseph wouldn't take no for an answer. Following the breakup, he continued to harass Tammy and would often show up at her home and her work, which of course greatly intimidated her. Some text messages would later be found on Tammy's phone, which were sent to Joseph. The messages go as follows. You can choose to be in denial about what happened on Saturday into Sunday. I won't be in denial. No one, and I mean no one, gets to terrify me like you did on Sunday. I will never forget it as long as I live. She went on to say, I do not want to involve the police, but if you leave me no choice, that is what I will have to do. Tammy called her father and asked him to change the locks on her home. Meanwhile, not feeling safe, Tammy stayed at one of her friend's houses for a couple of days. Once the locks were changed, she returned home and told her friends that she had the police on speed dial and kept chairs under the door handles of her house. At 3 a.m. on September 2014, Tammy awoke and heard the sounds of someone trying to break into her home. Of course, she knew exactly who this would be. She called 911 to say that her ex-boyfriend was trying to break in. The police soon arrived on the scene and told Joseph that he needed to move along. Joseph did as he was told, and the police watched him walk away. The police were content that no arrest had to be made. And the issue, as far as they were concerned, was settled. The following morning rolled around. Colleagues of Tammy clocked that she was late for work, but as more time passed, they became deeply concerned. Tammy was nowhere to be seen, and from what I can tell, she wasn't known to skip work and not call in as to why. The colleagues that worked with Tammy were very well aware of the troubles Joseph had been causing her. They began to assume that something was horribly wrong. So they contacted the police and asked them to go over to Tammy's house and check on her to see if everything was okay. Officers were dispatched to the location and arrived on the scene. They approached the house believing that what they would be dealing with was a simple welfare check. However, when officers arrived at Tammy's house, they found Joseph outside, and they noted that he seemed to be nervous. An officer also spotted that Joseph seemed to have cuts on his knuckles. As they inspected further, the door to Tammy's house appeared to have been kicked in. Now also concerned, officers told Joseph that they needed to pat him down to make sure that he didn't have any weapons that could potentially harm them. Upon asking this request, Joseph declined. So the officers had no other choice but to arrest Joseph and search him. During this search, they pulled out a knife from his pocket. And this knife was covered in blood. One of the officers later testified that she entered the home through the back door that had been kicked in. She found a trail of blood throughout the house. All over the walls, the floor, everywhere. They then entered the bathroom of the house. Inside, a tent covered the bathtub. They pulled back the tent and found Tammy's body in the tub. Her body had been horrendously mutilated, and she was missing a large part of her skull. Investigators were brought in to determine what exactly happened, and Joseph was taken into custody. When examining the crime scene and Tammy's body, investigators made a number of truly horrific and disturbing discoveries. Tammy had been stabbed dozens of times and had suffered severe blunt force trauma. An electrical power tool had been used to cut inside her body, and other tools were used to open up her chest, one of them being an electrical saw. Joseph had then used a knife to cut and remove parts of her lung and entire heart. Tammy's skull had also been cut with the power saw. Large chunks of her brain had been removed, some of which was found in the bathtub with her, along with large chunks of her skull. As Tammy's house was inspected, they discovered that part of her organs that were missing were found on a dinner plate next to the frying pan. Joseph had cooked and cannibalized Tammy. He had eaten parts of her brain, lung, and heart. Joseph was questioned. During this interview with the police, he explained that he had indeed eaten Tammy's brain, and that he had also tried to pull out her third eye with tongs. He also admitted to eating large parts of her lungs and heart. Investigators asked where Tammy's heart was. He replied by saying, "I ate it. It's part of me now." He was questioned as to why he ate her body. Joseph said she was already dead. After this interview, he was placed in a padded cell where he began to beat his chest and pant heavily. To commit such a gruesome crime usually means that the perpetrator is severely mentally ill. Mental health professionals began the lengthy process of determining if Joseph was mentally competent enough to stand trial. In the meantime, Joseph would change his story. He said that his head had been fuzzy following the murder of Tammy because he too had been attacked. So this is his second story. According to Joseph, he had gone to Tammy's house to collect some belongings. But upon entering her house, he had found two men who had broken in. Upon seeing Joseph, these two men supposedly attacked him and rendered him unconscious. He claimed that these two men had stabbed, killed, and eaten Tammy. Joseph also said that he believed the two men were planning to cut his head off and eat his brain. Joseph was charged with murder. After some time and after being assessed by multiple professionals, Joseph was deemed not mentally fit to stand trial in 2017. Joseph was then given medical and psychological treatment. And in 2018, he was deemed fit to stand trial, nearly 4 years after the crime had been committed. The trial would begin in 2019. This trial, however, wouldn't last long. One of the jury members was aware of Joseph's past. To have a fair trial, the jury was supposed to have no prior knowledge of his manslaughter conviction. This jury member spoke to a number of other jury members and told them what he had done previously. When the courts found out about this, the trial was ruled as a mistrial. A new trial would need to be set up. However, this again would take some time. The courts needed the go-ahead from mental health professionals that Joseph was fit again to stand trial. During this time, Joseph was offered an insanity plea, but Joseph declined to take it. He said to the judge that using the insanity defense would be in part amount to admitting guilt to the jurors and said, "I don't suffer from any mental illness." A second trial would begin in September of 2020, 6 years after the death of Tammy. During the trial, the jury was shown a number of photographs of the crime scene and were shown evidence that Joseph had consumed some of her brain, lungs, and heart. Before the jury were presented with these images, they were warned how graphic and gruesome they were, and were described as worse than anything you would see in a horror film. Joseph took to the stand and claimed that 2 black men had broken into Tammy's house and that they were the ones responsible for her death. When asked about the initial confession, Joseph stated that he had been coerced by investigators to confess and claimed that when he was being questioned, he was in a vulnerable state of mind. The defense then warned the jury not to be distracted from the facts of the case by, quote, emotional evidence. The prosecution stated that Joseph's story of intruders was a fabrication, and that he alone was responsible for the death and cannibalization of Tammy. The prosecutor said, "She suffered so many indignities that night. She was terrified, she was stabbed, she was dismembered, and she was eaten, all at the hands of Joseph." One of Tammy's friends also testified. She spoke of the horrific weekend Tammy had suffered at the hands of Joseph in the week before the murder. Messages were shown to the court from Tammy's phone, where she confided with this friend highlighting how she was scared of him. The 911 call placed by Tammy in the early hours of the morning before her murder was also brought up, showing that Joseph had already tried to break into her house that morning. A psychologist that assessed Joseph testified and stated that he was the most severely mentally ill person who she had ever reviewed. Joseph's defense told the court that he had a bulge lodged in his brain and that this was a major cause for his mental health issues. They went on to claim that this should be taken into account when finding him guilty or not guilty of murder. Joseph was thankfully found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was removed from court, he continued to insist that he was innocent. What is incredibly frustrating about this case is that Joseph has proven himself to be a serious danger to society not once, but twice. Yet, his lawyers are helping him to get a retrial and have launched an appeal. His defense lawyer said, "It would be easy to look at the horrors visited upon Tammy and conclude that they were simply the actions of a monster, but doing so would be reductive, and this court's review must look deeper. The court must consider his actions in the context of his profound mental illness." They went on to say, "There is also no question that Joseph was suffering from severe mental illness when he committed his crimes. What there is a question about, however, is whether Tammy would still be alive today if Joseph were not so severely mentally ill. There are reasons to believe that she would. Because of that, Joseph asks this court to find his sentence of life without parole inappropriate." End quote. As far as I can tell, these proceedings are ongoing. I would sometimes like to ask these lawyers who try to get such reoffending murderers off if they would ever like to live next door to them. The chances are they wouldn't. But if they were ever to somehow get a reoffending murderer out, someone would have to live next door to them. And just like how Tammy was unaware of his past, they could be too. As I mentioned earlier, in 2013, whilst Joseph was on parole, he choked someone out whilst he was naked and was allowed to be released on bail. The prosecutor who allowed this bail to go through resigned from his position following the death of Tammy. The case of Tammy is by far one of the most gruesome true crime cases out there. The horror of what happened to her is only compounded by just how long it took for Joseph to be brought to justice. Something that must have been horrendous for Tammy's family and for those who cared about her. The police who worked on this case have said that the crime scene was one of the most gruesome in Jeffersonville's history. I'm guessing many of you have likely heard of Ivan Milat, quite possibly one of the most notorious Australian criminals. If you haven't, then I shall give a brief summary as this case will be focusing on somebody else. Ivan Milat was found guilty of murdering 2 men and 5 women in Australia between 1989 and 1992. The bodies were discovered in the Langalo State Forest, a 9,400-acre wood in New South Wales. Ivan is often referred to as the backpacker killer due to his victims being backpackers. It is also believed that he killed many more people, although he did proclaim his innocence till the day he passed away from cancer aged 74. What some people don't know is that Ivan had a great-nephew named Matthew, and Matthew idolized his great-uncle. He had plans to make the family name even more notorious than it already was. This case takes place in New South Wales, Australia on the November 20, 2010. Matthew Millman was born in December of 1993, and as I said earlier, was the great-nephew of Ivan Milat. Those who knew Matthew would later say that he would often brag to people about who his uncle was and would even tell them shortly after meeting them. He would also enjoy going to the Belanglo State Forest so he could look at the memorial dedicated to the victims, taking pride in what his uncle had done. After the murders of Ivan came to light, a number of his family members decided to change their last names as to no longer be associated with such a twisted individual. Matthew, on the other hand, was disappointed that he didn't share the name, so he changed his second name to Milat. Many people who knew of Matthew were, of course, very wary of him. But despite being a rather unsavory individual, Matthew did have some friends and hung around with a group of lads. And one of these lads was 16-year-old David Akualoni. David was described as a popular young man who could, on occasion, be a little too trusting of people that he should be wary of, and Matthew was one of those people. David's grandma recalled a time when she saw an altercation between David and Matthew outside her home. She ran out and told Matthew to leave. Matthew walked up to her, got in her face, and tried to intimidate her before turning around and leaving. She said that after this, on a number of occasions, Matthew would drive past her house in an attempt to scare her. But as I said, David could be a little too trusting, so he and Matthew made up shortly after this. And now we arrive to the November 20th, 2010. This day was David's 17th birthday. He woke up that morning and spent the day with his mother and grandparents. He had a couple of beers with his grandfather and enjoyed some birthday cake. Later on into the afternoon, David had plans to meet some of his friends. These friends were Cohen Klein, Chase Day, and Matthew Merlot. The four went to grab something to drink and smoke. Matthew then told the group that they should all go to the Belangolo State Forest so the police wouldn't be able to stop them from drinking. And so they did. They all got into a car and began driving to the forest. The plan was to go and enjoy some drinks together to celebrate David's birthday. But Matthew had a far more sinister plan. That night, David didn't come home. At the time, he was living with his grandparents. They were concerned about him and tried to contact him. But when he failed to come home in the following days, they contacted the police and reported David missing. However, it wouldn't take long to find out what exactly had happened. On the November 22nd, Chase Day spoke to his father. He told him that something truly horrific had happened to David and that he needed to come clean. His father brought him into the station, and he began talking with investigators. Chase told them that Matthew had killed David in an incredibly cruel and brutal way. The story he told goes as follows. On the 20th, the four drove into the forest in Matthew's car. Once in the forest, Matthew got out of the car and walked towards the boot. He then shouted for David to come out and join him at the rear of the car. Chase then recalled hearing David scream. Matthew had hit David in the ribs with a large double-sided axe. He witnessed David run around the car away from Matthew, who was still wielding the weapon. David pleaded with Matthew not to harm him, but he didn't want to listen. Chase then got out of the car and pleaded with Matthew to stop hurting David, but he was powerless to stop him. Matthew turned around and began to swear at him, telling him to get back into the car and mind his own business. Matthew got David onto the ground and began toying with him. He made him lie down face into the dirt and accused him of talking about him behind his back. As David pleaded with Matthew, he swung the axe down upon him a number of times. After killing him, Matthew dragged his body into the bush to hide him. After hiding the body, Matthew got back into the car with Chase and Cohen and proceeded to drive home. Chase recalled Matthew being incredibly excited at what he had done. Matthew told them that killing David was such a rush for him. Shortly after this horrific confession, both Matthew and Cohen were arrested, set out to find David. It didn't take them long to find his body. David's grandparents were then tasked with identifying David's body. Cohen was questioned, and right away he tried to play the victim. He said he did indeed witness the crime taking place, but that he was terrified of Matthew and could do nothing to stop him. The investigators weren't quite convinced of his innocence. His home was searched, and there they found a mobile phone. This device was soon to be searched. Meanwhile, Matthew was also being questioned, but he refused to speak and just said no comment. His home was also searched, and there they found a pair of shoes that had blood on them. These shoes were later tested, and it was confirmed that the blood was David's. Both Matthew and Cohen were charged with murder, and Chase was charged as an accessory. The mobile that was found in Cohen's home was thoroughly searched, and on it, the police found a deleted file. The file was recovered, and it turned out it was a recording of the final moments of David's life. They found out that Matthew taunted him for some time before killing him, reveling in David's fear and accusing him of things that he had never done. They also found that Chase was telling the truth. While Cohen filmed what was happening, Chase did try to stop it. He begged Matthew to stop hurting David, but this resulted in Matthew becoming angry. As long as Matthew had the axe, Chase could do nothing, so he just got back into the car as he was told. An extract from the recording recovered from Cohen's mobile phone goes as follows. Matthew, look at the dirt. Don't look at me. Look at the dirt. David begins to cry. Matthew, keep looking at me and I'll cut your head off. Look at the ground. Tell me, is it true you're not going to be able to see cut your head off? Look at the ground. Tell me, is it true you've been going around telling people about my affairs? It's not true, Matt. Shut up. Put your hands down next to your face. Are you gonna keep meddling with me? David, no, I won't. I swear to God. Matthew, how do I know that? David, we've been mates for ages. My word is good. I swear to God to you, dude. I never said anything about you. Matthew, I really don't believe you. All right? David, man, I give you my word. I would not. Matthew, yeah, you've given me your word and your word isn't good enough. It's after this exchange that the sound of the axe hitting David's head can be heard. And then the recording ends. The murder and the 15 minutes leading up to it was hauntingly captured on an audio recording from Cohen's mobile phone. David was being submissive the entire time and tried his best to defuse the situation. Following this revelation, the charges against Chase were dropped, and he was asked to give evidence at the trial, to which he agreed. Before the trial would take place, the investigators recovered the murder weapon from a body of water inside the forest. Matthew was also evaluated by a mental health professional. It was found that he suffered from no conditions that would have caused him to commit such a horrific crime. The trial began, and it's said that Matthew showed little emotion and just kept his head down. It's one of the most notorious names in our criminal history. Now the Milat family has another killer in its ranks. Matthew Milat, a relative of Ivan, the serial killer, killed a mate in the Balanglo State Forest, the same place his uncle tortured and executed 7 backpackers. Today, for the first time, we can show you the face of teenage murderer Matthew Milat. Cohen Klein is his mate, and both have pleaded guilty to the axe murder of their one-time friend, David Octoloni. David's family fronted court today as a judge decides the penalty for the killers. It was David's birthday, November 2010, when Milat and Klein lured him into the Belangolo State Forest, the same killing fields used by Matthew's uncle, Ivan Milat. Both Matthew and Cohen were found guilty of murder. No motive for what happened was found. It just seemed that Matthew wanted to kill. Matthew was sentenced to 43 years in prison. He has since tried to appeal his sentence, but so far he has been unsuccessful. Cohen was sentenced to at least 22 years with a maximum 32-year term. He too has appealed his sentence and he was successful. His sentence was reduced from 32 to 27 years. When speaking about the horrific murder of David, his grandfather said, "They didn't just kill him, they tormented him. The love I have for David and the hatred I have for those animals who took him away, they deserve no mercy." What is incredibly eerie about this case is that during the sentencing hearing, it was revealed that Matthew had written poems during his time in custody. One poem called Your Last Day goes as follows. Click-clack. Hear that? Stopping in the middle of the track. Are you getting nervous in the back? You should be. You're getting whacked. Talk shit here. Talk shit there. No one's really gonna care. But talk shit with every breath you just signed away your health. I can see you start to sweat, wondering what you're gonna get. Hoping for one in the head. I'll put one in your leg. Tell me, are you having fun? Get up and start a run. How far are you gonna get? Your match you have just met. Stumbling all over the place. Hear the crunch of leaves and feet? Your heart will skip a beat. Are you gonna get away? No hope, kid. This ain't your day. The day that you won't be found 6 feet underneath the ground. Matthew takes a great delight in the crimes he had committed and is now referred to as the copycat Millat. A video on Ivan Millat is soon to come. And this case takes place in Blackpool, England on the November 1st, 2003. Charlene Downs was a 14-year-old girl who lived in Blackpool with her mother, father, brother, and 2 sisters. The life of Charlene is a rather tragic one and one that is hard to listen to, especially for those who have experienced SA. It seems that she never really had a chance in life, but we shall get into that later. An old close friend of Charlene who knew her very well described her as a lovely and caring girl. However, he said that when she was around 12 years old, her personality changed. She became more reckless and rebellious. Charlene's older sister is named Rebecca. At the time of this story taking place, she was 16 years of age. Out of all of the siblings, it's reported that Charlene and Rebecca were the closest and considered each other to be best friends. Rebecca moved out of the family home when she was 14 years old and moved into a house that was owned by a 50-year-old man. Rebecca has claimed that she and this 50-year-old man were not in a relationship. However, Many who knew her at the time have stated that this is untrue and that she was indeed in a relationship with this older man. Despite moving out, Rebecca and Charlene still remained very close. Rebecca Downs had moved out of the family home as soon as she could. This was because her father, Bob Downs, was known to be incredibly violent. If his children misbehaved, he would beat them, especially if he had had a couple of beers. Also, some very, very unsavory characters would often stay at the Downs household as guests. But we shall talk about this in depth further on. Charlene, too, was a victim of Bob's anger and violence. In fact, the Downs family had moved from the West Midlands to Blackpool in 1999. This was because both Karen and Bob risked losing their children as they had been investigated by the social services due to neglect, abuse, and multiple predators staying in the family's home. The authorities wanted to place the children into the care system. On the November 1, 2003, Charlene awoke at around 10 a.m. She got ready for the day and met her sister Rebecca. The two spent the day walking the streets in the arcades and in McDonald's. At around 6:45 p.m. that night, Charlene and Rebecca were walking towards Church Street, which is in Blackpool town center. During this time, their mother, Karen Downs, was handing out leaflets for a local restaurant. The three happened to bump into each other and spoke briefly. Rebecca told Karen and Charlene that she was going home and asked Charlene if she wanted to come with her. However, Charlene said that she wanted to meet some friends instead. So off Rebecca went alone. Karen walked with Charlene to a payphone, where she called some of her friends telling them to come and meet her. Karen stayed with Charlene until these friends arrived. Once the friends came, Karen told Charlene not to be home too late before going their separate ways. Now, what happened from this point on is a little unclear. Charlene and these friends spent some time together. She then met another friend and went to the Carousel bar situated on the North Pier. Footage would be found much later of what appears to be Charlene walking with an unidentified woman at around 9 p.m. The area in which Charlene is walking was known for the selling of illegal substances and is where working women were known to hang out. Charlene then meets other friends and hangs around the town center before making her way towards an alley on Abingdon Street. Charlene was spotted around this alleyway at around 10 to 11 p.m. It was the last time she would ever be seen again. When Charlene didn't make it home that night, Karen became concerned. However, she would later claim that she didn't worry too much. Charlene was 14, an age when teenagers are known to rebel, and put this down for the reason for her not coming home on time. Hours and days would pass. Charlene's parents didn't report Charlene missing for 2 whole days. When Karen phoned the police, she stated that Charlene had been missing since 8 o'clock on the Saturday, which was the November 1st. She reported Charlene missing on the Monday. Whilst on the phone, the police told Karen that they would send some officers over shortly to gather some information in hopes of being able to locate Charlene quickly. On the phone call, you can hear Karen reply, "I can't. I need to go out soon." To which the dispatcher replies in a shocked voice, "Your daughter is missing and she is 14. You need to stay in and speak to the police." The police went over to the Downs household and gathered information about Charlene, who she was with when she disappeared, what she was wearing, and where she was known to hang around. At first, the police put this case down as a runaway child. They assumed that Charlene would soon turn up once she ran out of money or missed her home. But this wasn't what happened. The police story of Charlene's disappearance, claiming that this was just another runaway story and she would be back soon. Although, after some more time passed with no leads, Charlene's mother contacted the media and asked them to publish an article along with a recent photograph of Charlene, which the media did. This is when Karen learned that the police told the media not to publish the story. The police received a large number of calls and tips from various people, all claiming to have seen Charlene in the days since her disappearance. One even claiming that they had seen her dead by a railway track. However, the vast majority of these tips did not lead to anything of significance. It soon became apparent that something was horribly wrong. When the police questioned Karen and Bob, they discovered that living with the family was a man named Ray Monroe. As I mentioned earlier, some very unsavory characters were living in the house, and Ray was one of them. Ray is a convicted predator. He was found guilty during the time he was living with the family. And 3 days after Charlene vanished, He was sentenced and jailed after he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of indecent assault and assaulting a 6-year-old boy. Ray was jailed for 4 years after pleading guilty. Bob has always insisted that he had no idea that Ray had pleaded guilty to these horrific crimes, claiming that he only found out about his crimes when he was sat in court during Ray's trial 3 days after Charlene had disappeared. The police began to suspect that perhaps Bob and Karen had a hand in Charlene's disappearance. Investigators also discovered the reason why the Downs family had moved from the West Midlands to Blackpool. When Charlene was just 9 years of age, she had accused a friend of Bob and Karen's of forcing themselves on her, among other things. When social services became involved, Bob and Karen moved and were somehow able to slip under the radar. If Charlene were to be found or if she ever came back, it was decided by the authorities that she would be put into their care system. However, this was never to happen. Years went by with no trace of Charlene. It also became clear to the police that Charlene, along with many other young girls, would frequent some of the local kebab shops, where they would do favors for the owners and workers in return for money, cigarettes, and alcohol. It's reported that Charlene had over 100 contacts. Men Oliver Blackpool would pay Charlene to perform acts on them for money. Charlene was one of over 60 girls in Blackpool who were being exploited by the takeaway owners who operated in a ring amongst various other predators. The youngest of these girls was 11. However, the police would keep this quiet until 2011. The next big development would occur in February 2006. A man by the name of David Cassidy came forward to the police with some information. He stated that 2 men were responsible for the murder of Charlene, Mohammed Raveshir and Ayed Al-Batiki. Raveshir was a 55-year-old takeaway owner and a foster parent to many children. Al-Batiki was 28 years old and was business partners with Ravasi. David Cassidy claimed to have heard that Ravasi had a number of young girls hanging around his home and his takeaway. David also claimed that Raveshir had been found inside his bed with 3 young naked girls, one of them being Charlene Downs. He also said he had heard that Charlene had performed oral acts on Al-Batiki in exchange for money. David Cassidy was described as a businessman. He had a slot machine arcade and supplied slot machines to takeaways. He was very familiar with many of the owners. The story that he told the police was that Charlene was a victim of exploitation and that she had told Raveshir and Al-Batiki that she was going to the police to turn them in because she was sick of being used by them. David claimed that he received this information from Al-Batiki's brother. The story was that Al-Batiki had killed Charlene and acquired help from Ravasi to dispose of the body. Based on these accusations from David Cassidy, Al-Batiki and Ravasi were detained and brought in. They were questioned and asked if they knew anything about the disappearance of Charlene Downs. The 2 men claimed that they had no idea who Charlene even was. Whilst the 2 men were detained by the authorities, the police went to Ravish's home and installed a number of secret recording devices along with a recording device in Ravish's car. For 4 weeks, the police listened in on private conversations. A total of 52 tapes were made over the course of the 4 weeks. And Detective Sergeant Jan Besant was the officer who volunteered to transcribe them. For 6 hours a day for almost a year, she listened to the tapes and tried to make sense of them. The recording devices in Raveshi's home were planted right near the television set, so static was picked up. This resulted in the audio being extremely poor quality. It's important to note that Jan had no qualifications to make her an expert in transcribing poor quality audio and had no knowledge of linguistic analysis. When speaking about what she heard in the tapes, Jan said, "In the first few tapes, clearly they were shocked and worried and panicking. The first thing they talk about is this murder inquiry. In the recordings, Jan heard the 2 men talking about a burial place and big bones. A small piece of the transcript is on screen now. In one of the recordings, Jan believes she hears Raveshir say, 'I can't cope. I'm so worried, and you were the one who killed her.' Raveshir then asks, 'Why did you kill her?' Al-Batiki replies saying, 'You're being stupid if you thought we'd ever release her.' Al-Batiki was also heard asking how long fingerprints last, to which Raveshir responds, 'There is nothing left of her. She was here. She died. There really is nothing.' Jen also claimed to hear the 2 men joking about how they had minced up Charlene's body, turned her into kebab meat, and served her flesh to unwitting customers. The 2 men were arrested and charged with the murder of Charlene Downs. The police spoke with Charlene's parents, Bob and Karen. They informed them of the arrest and told them they were 99% certain that Charlene had been murdered, although they didn't actually tell them about the way in which they believed she had been killed. The Downs family would find out when the media began running stories about the murder of Charlene, stating rumors that she had been chopped up and sold as kebab meat. Before telling the Downs family about these disturbing rumors, they had instead fed the media this information for them to distribute. This, of course, was an incredible shock to the family. It goes without saying that the headlines gripped the public. The story of a teenage girl being turned into kebab meat and being cannibalized by unwitting customers spread quickly. The trial would begin in February. The audio was presented to the court with a transcription going alongside informing the courts of what the men were saying, along with their witness, David Cassidy. Raveshire owned a number of properties in Blackpool. In his men residence, the investigators looked for any DNA evidence or blood that could prove that Charlene was either there or had been killed there. The prosecution team showed evidence and photographs of the home, showing that a number of floorboards had been replaced very recently along with other renovations to the house. Investigators had also noted that the place was unusually clean, like it had been scrubbed. No DNA evidence was found that belonged to Charlene. Albertiki and Ravish's defense team managed to convince the judge that David's testimony was merely hearsay and was not reliable, pointing to the fact that David had a long criminal history. The audio quality of the recordings was also contested. The defense argued that it was too unclear to be a reliable piece of evidence. The judge agreed that the transcript could only be cited as an interpretation and not as fact. The defense team also pushed that the recordings and the transcripts did not match up and that Jan wanted to solve the case so badly that she inserted what she wanted to hear into the transcriptions and were made to fit the narrative. For instance, the words burial place were mistranscribed. What was likely said was Paul's place. A tracker was placed on Raveshi's car. When the police checked to see where Raveshire had gone since the tracker had been placed on his car, they confirmed that he had actually visited his friend Paul. No such burial site was ever visited by Raveshire. However, what is rather odd is that both men were indeed talking about the disposal of big bones. Linguistic experts later confirmed that they were talking about bones and were joking about mincing somebody up in the kebab meat. Both men denied any wrongdoing and proclaimed their innocence. There was no evidence that either of the men had ever met Charlene. Then, a very damning piece of evidence was presented that shattered the prosecution's claims. Investigators had wired up David and gotten him to speak to Albertiki's brother again. Albertiki's brother being the one who told David about this whole story. David did as he was asked and spoke with Albertiki's brother about the alleged murder of Charlene. In this recording, the brother this time claimed that he had no idea what David was talking about. At the end of the recording, David says to the brother, "I must have gotten the wrong end of the stick." With these holes in the prosecution's evidence, the case fell through and resulted in a hung jury, meaning that the jury could not all collectively agree whether or not the two men were innocent or guilty. So they were released. The Downs family were outraged. They believed that the two men were guilty of murdering Charlene, and they still do. However, it was discovered that the two men knew some of the jury members, and so a retrial was set for 2008. But the Crown Prosecution Service found no evidence against the two men, and so this retrial was called off because it was claimed that the two men were falsely accused and falsely imprisoned. They both were given £250,000 each in compensation. Although, both men faced further accusations following the trial, with Albertiki being accused of saying 5 young women, and Raveshi being accused of abusing a young girl. Neither men were found guilty of any of these crimes. Following the trial, the police were investigated for what was seen as their major mishandling of evidence. It was found that many of the officers were untrained, incompetent, and held strong biases towards the two men. Because of Jan's alleged misinterpretations of the audio, she was ordered to resign following this grooming of young girls by a number of takeaway owners and workers. However, as I said earlier, this only came to light in 2011. In this report, it was said that Charlene had performed oral in exchange for food. The number of girls mentioned in this report was around 60. However, this could be a lot higher. Many of these girls were incredibly vulnerable, coming from abusive homes and many in the care system. Now, let's delve a little deeper into the Downs family. A week after the trial had ended, Karen took a knife and stabbed Bob. Bob survived and refused to press charges against Karen, stating that she was just under a lot of pressure due to the trial collapsing. Rumors had been circulating that Bob had been allowing men to have relations with his children in exchange for money. Bob was described as an alcoholic. One theory was that he allowed his children to be used in exchange for money. On many occasions, convicted predators had been found living or staying in Karen and Bob's house. Bob would often go out drinking and invite random men back to the house for more drinks. Allow me to quickly men back to the house for more drinks. Allow me to quickly go through some very strange allegations made against Bob and Karen. A leaked court document from 1989 shows that the Downs family had been investigated by the West Midlands Police and the social services. This was because a convicted predator had been found to be giving their 3-year-old daughter, Emma, rides in his car. In 1999, it was alleged that some of Bob's friends engaged in inappropriate behavior with some of the Downs children. In February, Charlene told a social worker that one of Bob's friends had touched her inappropriately. In February, Charlene was found by a social worker lying in bed with a man in his 60s. This incident occurred in the Downs home in Blackpool. Charlene was then later seen counting some money. And of course, before Charlene vanished, the man I mentioned earlier, Ray Monroe, was living with a family. It's reported that many people saw Charlene sitting on Ray's lap inside the Downs family home. At least 16 males who have committed various offenses involving children have had access to the Downs' family home in the West Midlands and in Blackpool over a 15-year period. It's entirely possible that it's more than 16. I do have to make this clear. These are all allegations, although it is confirmed that Charlene attended a health clinic 12 times. It was noted that she had bruises to her private area on multiple occasions. Karen was aware of these visits to the clinic. However, she claimed that she never thought much of it. Charlene's blood was also found in the Downs household. However, this is something that can be expected as, of course, she did live there. I've also seen some reports that claim that the Downs family did not fully cooperate with the police during the beginning of the investigation. The theory is that Bob allowed men to come back to his home where he would allow these men to have access to his children in exchange for money so he could buy more booze. One of these men may have either deliberately or accidentally killed Charlene, and the parents helped to cover up her death to save themselves. Some people think that Bob may have killed Charlene in a fit of rage. Both Bob and Karen deny having any part in the disappearance of Charlene. A number of other suspects have been questioned by the police over the years. However, nothing has ever come of it. The most recent suspect is a man named Nigel Lloyd. It's said that Nigel knew the Downs family and Charlene. Nigel is a 51-year-old convicted predator. He was found guilty of attacking 2 young girls between 2001 and 2003 in Blackpool, which was around the time when Charlene was walking the streets. There are also some rumors that the two spoke on the night that Charlene went missing. Nigel's flat also looked the alley near the takeaways where Charlene was known to frequent. Nigel was recently arrested and questioned. However, nothing ever came of this either. So what exactly happened to Charlene Downs? Do you think Albertiki and Raveshire were responsible? Although the recordings were somewhat debunked, many parts of the audio are still very suspicious. Regardless, many people, including the police, believe the 2 men to be extremely dangerous. Or do you think that the parents had anything to do with her death? The case of Charlene is incredibly tragic. Reading about her early childhood made me feel sick to my stomach. I can already feel that some people will judge Charlene for her behavior, but I do think it's important to remember and to take into account what she went through when she was younger and the kinds of people who were allowed to live in her home. Detective Chief Superintendent Andy Webster has said, "We remain fully committed to finding Charlene's killer and her body. A £100,000 reward remains on offer for information leading to the conviction of her killers or the recovery of her body. If you do know anything about the murder of Charlene Downs, please see the relevant links in the pinned comment." Investigators have taken more than 4,800 witness statements and followed 10,500 lines of inquiry. But the case still remains unsolved. As of the release of this video, Charlene has been missing for just shy of 20 years. This case takes place in Sweden on the August 17, 1995. John Horan was a 14-year-old who lived in Kungälv, Sweden. Those who knew John described him as a good-natured young lad and a very promising canoeist. John often competed in various competitions and did very well for himself. In a national competition in the summer of 1995, he was able to win a bronze medal. His success was often written about in local and national news. Due to this success, some of those in his school would become jealous, and some would bully him due to their envy. The school that John attended had somewhat of an issue with students that were a part of racist organizations. For example, a number of students were a part of the Swedish White Aryan Resistance. It was these students that would threaten John on a regular basis. At the end of the 1980s, a new Nazi movement had developed in Sweden. This movement rapidly expanded during the 1990s and was able to recruit many young people. With mail-order merchandise available, many of these young people hung Nazi propaganda and memorabilia in their rooms. Bullying aside, John had a particular dislike towards these students because of their beliefs. He had a strong dislike for those who engaged new wave of Nazism. John's father would later say that these students threatened John for well over a year. However, the school did very little to put an end to the torment. One bully at the school that would often try to intimidate John, and had even threatened to kill him, was 15-year-old Michael. However, if Michael ever tried anything, John would always stick up for himself and was known to stick up for others too. On the August 17, 1995, those summer holidays were coming to an end. So John and a good friend of his, Christian, decided to go camping by a lake. Right after finishing putting up their tent, the two teens were relaxing next to a fire, blissfully enjoying their time before school would start again. Although, coincidentally, the bully from John's school, Michael, was also at that very same lake. He was there with three other friends, 18-year-old Daniel Hansen, who was the ringleader of the group, 17-year-old John Billing, and an 18-year-old that was only referred to as BM. All three of Michael's friends were members of Nazi groups, and they had all been drinking heavily. Daniel, in particular, was known to be extremely violent. He was constantly getting into fights, had hit his girlfriend, and had even been convicted of stabbing someone in his youth. The four happened to see Christian and John's fire from their position at the lake. Michael was told by his older friends to go over and see who was there. Upon seeing John, he ran back to his friends and suggested that they all go over together and attack John. All four agreed. With beers in hand, they walked round to where John and Christian were. One of them, holding a full can of beer, took aim and threw the can into John's face as hard as he could. The four then began to savagely beat him and demanded that he say, "I love Nazis." John refused this demand, and so they continued to attack him. They punched him, kicked him, and stomped on him. One of the attackers would later brag that John was so scared that his eyes were extremely wide, and that he was clearly in a great amount of fear. But then, the four helped him up, grabbed him a beer, and began talking to him in a civil manner, apologizing for the beating they had given him. But this was just part of their sick and twisted plan. As they assured John that they would stop, one of the attackers came behind him and punched him in the back of the head. They continued the attack. John could do nothing but try his best to defend himself, an almost impossible feat against four people. Outnumbered and held at knife point, Christian was forced to watch his friend be mercilessly beaten. The attackers then grabbed all of John and Christian's belongings, put them inside the tent, and set the tent alight, destroying absolutely everything. One of them picked up a piece of wood that was on fire and hit John in the back of the neck. The two begged to be let go. The four attackers ignored these pleas and continued to beat John. They would pretend to be sorry, help him up, and then would continue the attack. They did this for hours in what was a truly horrific act of torture. The four then pushed John into the lake. Now fully in the water, John was able to swim away from them. John Billing and BM ran around the other side of the lake so they would be able to grab him if he tried to get out and run. However, Michael and Daniel waited with Christian in case John swam back to that area. John was a strong swimmer and would have had no issue in getting away. But as he was swimming in the water, he heard Michael and Daniel shout to him, "We will kill your friend if you don't come back." Christian was then forced to cry out, "Please come back or they're going to kill me." John could have swam to safety far away from his torturers. But upon hearing his friend in need, John swam back to the bank and got out of the water. Once John was back on land again, the two main attackers, Daniel and Michael, continued to viciously beat him until John fell to the ground unconscious. Even when he was unconscious, they continued to kick him in the stomach as hard as they could and repeatedly stomped on his head. They would later say that the violence they were inflicting upon John felt so good that they just couldn't stop. After they were done beating John, and as he lay unconscious on the ground, they rolled him into the lake and watched him as he sank and drowned. Michael and Daniel then met up with the other two that went round the lake and told them that they had thrown John into the water whilst he was unconscious, joking around about how he sank like a stone. The four then packed up and made their way home. They left Christian alone and physically unharmed. Christian managed to make his way to a road and hitchhike home. When he got home in the early hours of the morning, he woke his parents up and told them their devastating news. They contacted the authorities and told them about the horrific murder. Christian was able to tell the police exactly who was responsible, and all four were swiftly arrested. Christian also led the police to the location where they had beaten John and thrown him into the water. John's body was found and his face was completely unrecognizable. As always, be careful when researching this case. There are some images of John on the internet, and it isn't nice to see. John's parents wanted the images to be made public to show everyone what the four attackers had done to their son. John had been beaten so badly that the coroner said that he had never seen anything like it before, and that it seemed that John had been hit by a car. He had extreme injuries to his head and bleeding on the brain, along with extreme internal injuries and internal bleeding. A number of John's teeth had also been broken. The pain and fear John must have been in his final moments is just unthinkable. Those who inspected his injuries stated that even if John had not been thrown into the water, he would likely still have died from the beating. The same day they found John's body, the four attackers were questioned by the police. The ringleader, 18-year-old Daniel, was told to describe the events that had taken place the day before. Daniel said, "I think his name was John," and denied having any major involvement in the murder of John, but he would later admit to his part. The bully from John's school, Michael, spoke to the police and gave a full confession, describing exactly how he and his friends had beaten John, and took part in a reenactment of the murder for the police, even showing them how he and Daniel rolled John's body into the lake. The murder attracted enormous attention, and thousands of people took part in protest marches across the country. On the September 22, 1995, the trial began. Despite pleas from John's parents and the public, the vast majority of the trial was kept behind doors. The media was not given access to report on the details. On the October 2nd, a verdict was reached. The 18-year-old ringleader, Daniel, was sentenced to 8 years in prison for murder. 15-year-old Michael, the bully from John's school, was sentenced to 5 years for murder. The other two who left the scene before John was killed were found guilty of aggravated assault. One of them was sentenced to 10 months in prison, and the other 4 months in prison. Whilst in prison, Michael was stabbed in the eye with a screwdriver by older neo-Nazis. They did this because he spoke to the police in detail about the murder. And inside prison, Daniel, along with other inmates, formed the Swedish version of the Aryan Brotherhood. When speaking about killing John, Daniel said, "I didn't even know John. If it had not been him, it would have been someone else." He then went on to say that he would not have committed the crime if he was sober. As for where these people are now, I couldn't find any information. John's father now keeps a framed portrait of John in the living room in his home. And upstairs, he keeps boxes filled with photographs and newspaper clippings and awards that John won. A movie has also been made about the murder of John, which is available to watch online. In an interview, John's father said, "Of course, it would be easier to live if you could just forget. But once you become a dad, you're always a dad. You cannot escape it. John's murder has affected my whole life, and they haven't taken just John. It's the grandchildren and the whole piece that has been taken away from us." A non-profit foundation was established in the memory of John. Its purpose is to work against youth violence in Sweden, and John's parents went around schools talking about the dangers of getting involved in such violent organizations. What is also disgusting about this case is that John's grave has been vandalized a number of times by neo-Nazis. The cases I cover are very dark, and all of them are incredibly tragic. However, there are some details in some cases that just really get to me. The fact that these 4 killers bragged about how wide John's eyes were whilst he was being attacked because he was so scared is something that just left me feeling sick to my stomach. This case takes place in the United Kingdom on the August 29, 2019. Debbie Leach was a 24-year-old woman who lived in Blackpool. Debbie had Down syndrome and suffered with a number of other health issues. Because of this, she was described as vulnerable and was dependent on her mother, Elaine Clark. Debbie's mother and father broke up when she was just 5 years old, and Elaine weaponized Debbie against her father, Tom Leach. She would make it incredibly hard for Tom to see Debbie. He made attempts to see his daughter, but Elaine would always find ways to stop it from happening. Visitation would be kept at a minimum. Elaine was Debbie's primary carer. She was registered as her carer and received payments so she would be able to fulfill this role for her daughter. Elaine had 3 other children, all of them with learning and physical difficulties. It's reported that the social services were very well aware of the family due to Elaine's parenting. Those who knew her, even close family, viewed her as a selfish and lazy mother. Elaine and her children moved to Leeds in 2014 and then to Blackpool in 2016. It's reported that whilst living in Leeds, Debbie attended a care center, went to college, had plenty of friends, and had a boyfriend. She was described by a support worker as shy, but was outgoing when she got to know someone, and by all accounts was somewhat happy. When they moved to Blackpool in 2016, Elaine did not allow Debbie to go to a New Day Care Center and New Day Care Center, and Elaine stopped providing as much care despite receiving enhanced benefits for caring for Debbie. In April of 2018, Debbie had a checkup from her GP. The GP became deeply concerned for her well-being when he noticed she had Norwegian scabies, a condition known to be associated with neglect. Debbie received treatment and was discharged. A follow-up appointment was required and set up, but Elaine did not bring Debbie in for the follow-up. Because of this, the hospital made a safeguarding referral to adult social services. However, nothing came of this despite the concerns that Elaine was neglectful carer before this even occurred. In autumn of 2018, social services began investigating Elaine due to her other daughter and grandson, who lived in her home with her too. The home was found to be an inadequate standard for them to live in. The court documents describe the filthy conditions of the home. Whilst this was being investigated, a file was also opened for Debbie as they found that she was not registered to access a care center. These care centers provided much relief for Elaine, allowed social services to keep a better eye on her, and would give Debbie a much-needed social life. However, Elaine never followed up with the meetings that were set in place. There was a reason for this. The neglect had gotten much worse, and Elaine didn't want people to see the deterioration of Debbie. In 2019, family members and friends who visited Elaine's home saw the condition Debbie was in. Debbie had scabs on her body and had lost a considerable amount of weight. Debbie was known by those who knew her for her long hair, which she kept in good condition. Those close to her would later describe how she would often brush it to keep it looking perfect. But due to her clearly receiving an inadequate amount of nutrition, her hair was now short, thin, and scraggy. Upon seeing Debbie in such a condition, the family expressed their concerns to Elaine, but these concerns were simply dismissed. In April of 2019, relatives came over again. They asked where Debbie was, but Elaine just told them that she was unwell and that no one was allowed to go into her room. Although Elaine's niece didn't listen to this. She instead snuck away and entered Debbie's bedroom. What she found horrified her. The room was dark, untidy, and had a horrid smell. The niece walked further into the room to find Debbie in bed. She told Debbie to get up and to come downstairs. Debbie was incredibly frail. She was able to get up, but with great difficulty. Debbie struggled to walk as she made her way downstairs to the other relatives. She was crying. Her clothing was heavily soiled and appeared to be rotten. Elaine's sister told her that if she did not sort out Debbie's condition within the next 2 weeks, she would report her to the authorities. In the weeks that followed, Elaine assured her sister that Debbie's condition had improved. But this was a lie. In July, a party was held for Elaine's son. Relatives were told that Debbie was in her room and did not want to see anyone. They didn't believe a word of it, and they went to go and see Debbie in her room. As soon as they entered, they were hit by an appalling stench. Plates full of rotten food and dirty nappies surrounded her bed. Her skin was scabby and sore. The family confronted Elaine, but she rejected their concern. The family would later say that they could hear Debbie crying out for her mother, but Elaine didn't go to her. They told Elaine that Debbie would die if she was left in those conditions for much longer. The family contacted social services as safeguarding alert was sent to the family's GP, who visited that very evening. Elaine realized that they had called the authorities, so she quickly got Debbie out of her bed and brought her into the shower. With hot water and soap, she began to clean Debbie's skin. Her skin was covered in large sores and rashes. The hot water and soap entering these wounds would have been incredibly painful. Debbie's siblings could hear her screaming in agony. Now clean, she dressed Debbie in oversized clothing, managed to get her looking somewhat presentable before the doctor arrived. There was a knock at the door. Elaine greeted the doctor, who came in to check on Debbie's well-being. She told the doctor that Debbie was having some trouble controlling her bowels, and she told the doctor that Debbie was having some trouble controlling her bowels and bladder, so she had given her nappies to wear. She said that her family had seen Debbie before her nappy had been changed, and that this was the reason for her being dirty. Elaine told the doctor that her family had overreacted and that there was nothing wrong. The doctor noticed some sores and some dry skin, but he did not diagnose scabies at the time. He left and no further action was taken. On the August 1st, a prearranged visit occurred. Because these visits were prearranged, Elaine had time to clean Debbie and tidy her room so the authorities would not suspect a thing. Social services noted that Debbie did appear to be unwell, but noted that there were no serious concerns. It wasn't uncommon for Debbie's siblings to hear her crying. They would ask Elaine why their sister was upset, but Elaine just told them that Debbie was attention-seeking and to ignore her. Neighbors would also later say that they could hear Debbie crying. She could be heard shouting, "Mommy, Mommy," in her final days. These neighbors spoke with Elaine, but she just told them that Debbie was ill and to not worry about her cries. It would be on the August 29, 2019 that Elaine called the emergency services to report that Debbie had been ill for a while and had passed away. Her medical team was sent to Elaine's home. She told them that Debbie had not been eating or drinking for the last few days and that she had found her dead in her room. The medical staff began walking up the stairs and entered into Debbie's bedroom. Immediately, they were hit with a foul odor. Debbie was lying on the floor in an unnatural position. Rigor mortis had set in. She was surrounded by her own feces. Maggots were found on the floor and near to Debbie's body, and her clothing was rotten. The medical staff couldn't believe the state Debbie's body was in. It was obvious that she had been neglected to an extreme degree. Debbie's face was covered in so many scabs that she was no longer recognizable. Her once luscious hair was incredibly thin, and large amounts of her skin was missing due to ulceration. The scabies mites had been allowed to breed and multiply, reflecting an infection that had taken some time to develop. The pathologist determined that the cause of death was severe emancipation and neglect with extensive and severe scabies skin infection. It said that her skin looked like raw flesh and was described like something out of a horror movie. Those who conducted the autopsy said that as they cut away her clothing, bits of skin came away with it, as her flesh and clothing had fused together, and mites were found crawling all over her back. According to medical records, Debbie usually weighed around 10 stone, which is 140 pounds or 63 kilograms. At the time of her death, Debbie weighed just 3 stone and 10 pounds. This is 52 pounds or 23 kilograms. She was described as just skin and bone. Elaine was questioned by the police. She lied and told them that she had done everything she could for Debbie, but that she was ill and was refusing food. The police didn't buy a word of this. She was arrested and charged with manslaughter. Debbie's father, Tom, didn't find out right away about his daughter's death. Instead, he saw that she had died in a Facebook post. When he inquired further, he found out about the horrific way his daughter had died. Tom would later say that he was not allowed to give Debbie a decent burial. This was because Elaine was allowed to make arrangements. He told the media, "I managed to get half of her ashes and I buried her in a local church right next to my dad. At least I was able to do that for her." Tom went on to say, "Every time she saw me, her face lit up. All I can do now is try to remember the good times. But the good times have been mad forever by what happened." Before the trial, Elaine pleaded not guilty and tried to claim that she was innocent. There was overwhelming evidence that she had purposefully neglected Debbie and watched her slowly die in agonizing pain and misery, helpless to save herself. 10 days before the trial would take place, her lawyer urged her to change her plea to guilty. Realizing that this would give her a far more lenient sentence, she agreed. Elaine pleaded guilty. During the trial, Elaine spoke about her troubled upbringing as a means to justify her poor parenting skills and the neglect of Debbie. However, no real explanation was ever given. Elaine never gave a reason as to why she treated her own daughter in such a cruel way. When Elaine tried to pin all of her behavior on her upbringing, the judge told her that this does not offer an excuse for the way she allowed Debbie to die. Evidence was presented, which showed how Debbie's condition deteriorated over many months. They showed how Elaine prepared Debbie for the prearranged visits from the doctor and social workers so that she appeared to be in better condition than she actually was. There was plenty of opportunity for Debbie to be saved. But instead, Elaine tried her best to cover her tracks to allow her to continue to neglect Debbie. She obviously knew how to care for Debbie well enough to present her in an acceptable condition to the doctors. But once they left, she went right back to tormenting and torturing her daughter with neglect. The judge overseeing the case said, "You were her mother. She lived with you and you were also paid for her care. The failures in your care of Debbie were so grossly negligent as to be criminal. You may be in denial, but you cannot pretend that this is not true. The condition in which Debbie was found shows that not only did you not do your best, but that you must have done absolutely nothing to care for her in the last days of her life. Instead, you simply abandoned her to die alone, in pain, and without nourishment in the most awful of physical surroundings. The suffering she must have experienced is readily apparent to anyone who has seen the photographs and read the papers in this case." Elaine was found guilty of manslaughter and was sentenced to 9 years and 7 months. Following Elaine's incarceration, the Solicitor General called for her sentence to be reviewed, as she believed it to be far too lenient. However, those who investigated the appeal stated that Elaine's guilty plea, her lack of previous convictions, her own personal difficulties, and the demands placed on her by being the sole carer of 4 children with additional needs led them to believe that the sentence was fair. Backing up the judge by stating, "The judge in this case took the necessary care." Her sentence remarks were lengthy and detailed. She identified and considered all the relevant factors of this very serious case. There is no basis which this sentence can be classed as unduly lenient. The effect is that the sentence remains as before. And so, the appeal to lengthen her sentence was rejected, and it's likely that Elaine will only serve a fraction of her sentence. This case takes place in the United States of America on New Year's Eve 2014. Christian Gomez was a 23-year-old man who lived in Oldsmar, Florida with his mother, 48-year-old Maria. In his younger years, Christian was described as being polite, caring, and kind. Although, when he turned 18, his behavior began to change rapidly. He began to isolate himself and displayed some worrying behavior. He lost his job, stopped taking care of his hygiene, but what was most concerning was that his family would often find him standing outside in the garden talking to himself. He then all of a sudden began acting inappropriately towards his younger teenage sister and would make advances towards her. He did this so often that Maria would no longer allow Christian to be home alone with his sister. Not surprisingly, his sister no longer felt safe at home, so she decided to live with other relatives. From February 2009, Christian was arrested 3 times, twice for resisting an officer without violence and once for disorderly conduct. Worried for her son, Maria took him to a psychiatrist and had his mental health evaluated. Christian was diagnosed with depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. Christine was prescribed a number of pills to treat his issues. However, he would often refuse to take them, causing his mental health to spiral further. Christine would spend the vast majority of his time in his room, isolating himself from his family and former friends. His family would also find him sitting in the garden with his Bible, talking to the stars. To keep his behavior under control, Maria would have to sneak his medication into his food and drinks. This was the only way she would be able to get him to take it. Although, despite Christian taking the medication, his behavior was still not under control. Maria took Christian to various mental health professionals. All they would do would offer different combinations of pills at different doses. Maria tried her best to get him put into some kind of facility where he could be treated for his issues with people who would be able to care for him properly. Maria was able to get Christian a therapist. Christian told this therapist that he was paranoid his family were watching him through the television, and that at night, he would hear voices talking to him coming from under his bed. He would often struggle to sleep as he had to flip the mattress multiple times a night to see who was underneath. He also mentioned that he felt like he was a burden to his family, especially his mother. Maria did everything she could for Christian. She would leave work early to take him to his mental health appointments and would pay for all of his medication. Her dedication to Christian resulted in her losing her job. However, she held on to the hope that one day, she would be able to get Christian the help he needed to make him better again. Even though Maria did have hope, she was somewhat scared of Christian. Due to hearing voices under his bed, Christian would often sit in the living room during the night in total darkness. Just in case he became violent, Maria would sleep with a knife underneath her pillow. And now we arrive at New Year's Eve of 2014. Christian also has an older brother named Mario. At this time, Mario was 27 years old and had moved out, but he was home for the festive period. Around this time, Christian had spiraled even further. He was isolating himself more and more and spent most of the festive period in his room alone. Christian's sister Maria was also visiting for New Year's. At this point, she was 16 years old. Later on in the evening, Maria cooked a meal for Christian, Mario, and Maria, and the four of them dined together. Shortly after the meal, Maria dropped her daughter off at work, leaving Christian and Mario alone in the house together. Maria then returned home shortly after and began moving boxes from their garage into the attic. For the past few days, Maria had needed help carrying some of these boxes. She had asked Christian for help numerous times. However, he always refused. That was until this day, New Year's Eve. Mario would later say that he was sitting in the living room reading a book, when Christine approached him without saying a word and just sat and watched him. After a few minutes passed, Maria came into the room. She asked Christine again if he would help her take some of the boxes from the garage into the attic. This time, Christian said yes and followed his mother into the garage. Mario then continued to read his book. As he was reading, he heard what sounded like a thud coming from the garage, but no other sounds followed. Not thinking much of it, Mario just went back to reading. Shortly after, a woman named Veronica, who was friends with Maria, came to the house. Veronica had come by as Maria had said she would help dye her hair for her. However, when Veronica approached the house, she was met with Christian, who was standing by the garage door mopping the ground. She looked down to where he was standing to see him mopping up what looked like red paint. Veronica didn't think much about this red paint. She simply assumed that at some point, paint had been spilled in the garage, and that Christian was just mopping it up. Veronica spoke with Christian, but noticed that he was behaving very strangely. She pulled out her mobile phone and made a call to Maria to let her know that she arrived and that Christian was acting strange. Maria didn't pick up the phone. Veronica instead sent a number of messages, but again, she got no response. Thinking that something was off and that the family may have had an argument, she decided to leave without knocking on the door. Around half an hour had passed since Mario had last seen his mother, and he was still reading his book. But then it dawned on him that he had not seen or heard his mother or Christian since they went into the garage. Confused and slightly concerned, Mario walked around the house looking for his brother and mother, but he was unable to see either of them. He then made his way to the garage. Upon entering, Mario was met with a puddle of blood on the ground. A bloody axe was leaning against the wall, and a trail of blood led to outside. Mario followed the trail of blood, which led out of the garage and to the side of the house near some bins. It's there where he found his mother's decapitated body, and Christian was nowhere to be seen. Mario immediately called 911. The police soon arrived, and they were met with the gruesome scene. Mario was in a frantic state, but he did his best to explain the situation to the police. Mario told the officers of his brother's condition and explained that he believes his brother is the one responsible. The police found Maria's body next to the bins outside of the house, with her head inside one of the bins. The search to find Christian began. Police cars and helicopters searched the nearby area. News of the tragic event spread quickly around the locals, who kept an eye out for Christian. However, it wouldn't be long until he was found. Christian had fled the scene on his bike. A few blocks away from where he lived, Christian saw a group of people in an open garage. He approached them and asked if he could have one of their beers. Noticing how strange he was behaving, one of the men gave him a bottle of water instead. As the man passed Christian the bottle of water, he noticed that his ankles were covered in blood. Christian took the water, got back onto his bike, and left quickly. Only minutes later, a police helicopter passed overhead. Knowing that something was seriously wrong, this man called the police and reported that he had just seen something extremely suspicious. At 8 p.m. that night, officers in a police car found Christian on his bike. They pulled in front of him, resulting in Christian falling off his bike. He was then arrested. Christian was taken to the station and questioned. He was told to explain why and how he killed his mother in such a horrific way. He explained that he had planned the murder of Maria for over 2 days. He claimed that she had been nagging him to move some boxes, and that he had enough of the nagging. He also said that his brother Mario was home for the New Year celebrations, and claimed that his mother was giving all of her attention to him instead. The lack of attention he was receiving made him furious. Because of these two combined factors, Christian decided to kill his mother with an axe. When Maria asked him to move the boxes into the garage, he followed her. And once they entered, Christian grabbed the axe that was located in the garage. Whilst Maria's back was still turned, Christian picked up the axe and began to strike his mother repeatedly. To quote Christian, "I swung it at her like a baseball bat." Maria then fell to the ground. With the axe, Christian proceeded to decapitate his mother, drag her to the bins, and threw her head into the bin. After a very brief attempt at cleaning the crime scene, Christian then got onto his bike and fled the scene. As he described this to the officers, he was emotionless and showed no remorse for what he had done. He simply told them, "I finished her." The sheriff spoke with the media and said, in a very calm, cool way, Christian explained what he did, why he did it, and what happened. And by talking to him, you wouldn't know he had any mental illness. Christian was charged with murder and denied bond. As Christian had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had also been Baker acted in 2013, his mental health was further evaluated. It was found that he was unfit to stand trial. For over 3 years, Christian was held in a psychiatric hospital and treated for his condition. At first, he was known to violently lash out at the guards. Christian was offered a plea deal, to which he accepted. He was sentenced to 25 deal, to which he accepted. He was sentenced to 25 years, followed by 10 years of probation and further treatment. Maria's family believed that the state's mental health system failed her. They said it was next to impossible to find any help when their family needed it the most, and mentioned how incarceration was instant following Maria's murder. They made the point that Christian's mental state would have inevitably led him to being incarcerated, either innocently for his safety and for the safety of others, or because he committed a horrific crime. Surely a preemptive measure would have been better than a woman losing her life. Maria's daughter said, "My mum loved Christian. She would do anything to protect him, but nobody could ever help us. She went to therapists, psychiatrists, and counselors. Every time something else happened, they would say up his dose of medication. They didn't take the time to look at Christian and figure out what was really wrong with him." Maria's brother also made a statement. He said, "What happens after he's released? Where is he going to go? His sister is afraid of him, and I mean terrified. Not only did he kill her mum, but he wanted to make her his woman. Nobody just kills their mum and takes her head. This was different. This was evil." This case takes place in Liverpool, England on the November 13, 1999. Michael Moss was a 15-year-old who lived in Liverpool. He was born in 1983, and it's reported that growing up, Michael wasn't a very academic person. He was, however, very mechanically minded. His mother would later reminisce about the times early in his life where he would dismantle a bicycle completely and then put it back together again just for the fun of it. As he got older, Michael developed a keen interest for motorbikes and became very passionate. Michael was also incredibly close with his father, and the two had a very strong relationship. However, his father tragically suffered a brain hemorrhage, and Michael was only 11 when this happened. His father was rushed to hospital and managed to make some improvements, although the damage to his brain changed him a great deal. Before the brain hemorrhage, he was described as a good man. But after, he became more aggressive. A brain injury can actually greatly change a person's behavior. And when Michael and his mother visited his father in hospital, he would often lose his cool. He would swear and even spit at Michael and his mother. Seeing this drastic change and seeing his father deteriorate deeply affected young Michael. His grief would only grow when his father sadly passed away following the brain hemorrhage. He was never able to leave the hospital. After seeing his father's passing, Michael's behavior began to change. His father's death took a great toll on his mental health. At school, he became too much for the faculty to handle, and he was subsequently expelled. After being expelled, Michael was placed into a pupil referral unit. This educational unit was called Pinefields and was set up for children with learning and behavioral needs. However, Michael's behavior was still a big issue. Michael's mother, Liz, was still grieving from the loss of her husband and was now struggling to deal with Michael's behavior. As a result of this, social workers suggested to Liz that Michael should move into a children's home. This was done so Liz could have a break. And so that's what happened. In 1999, Michael moved into the children's home. At this time, he was aged 15. This unit was set up in a way where Michael would be free to leave at any time. This included going to visit his mother or even going out at the dead of night. Michael had settled in well at the pupil referral unit, but also attending this unit were 15-year-olds, Alan Bentley and Mark McKeefray. Both Alan and Mark were friends and had been expelled from their previous school. The two were the school bullies and had badly beaten up another pupil, causing him serious injury. And because of this, they too were sent to the unit. Despite being the school bullies, the two had never committed any serious crimes outside of school, and neither had a criminal record. However, Mark and Alan continued to bully pupils at this referral unit too. Michael decided to keep his distance, but he still remained friendly with them. Another pupil then joined this unit, 16-year-old Graham Neary. Graham quickly became friends with Alan and Mark. Alan also had a girlfriend, but in October of 1999, she ended their relationship to be with Michael. This greatly angered Alan. He would often tell his friends that he wanted to stomp all over Michael's head and kill him. Alan, however, did not act right away. Instead, he thought of ways to get back at Michael. On the November 12, 1999, Alan had his friends over at his house to celebrate his birthday. These friends included Mark McKeefray, Graham Neary, and another friend named Neil Breslin. The four watched the movie Reservoir Dogs, shared a bottle of vodka and some cider, and all of them became somewhat intoxicated. Whilst they were all drinking, Alan brought up the situation with his ex and Michael, and began talking like he usually would, stating that he wanted nothing more than to beat Michael up for taking his girlfriend away from him. The more alcohol that was consumed, the more Alan wanted to take action. He then devised a plan. At around 1 a.m. that night, which was now the November 13th, Mark made a call to Michael, who was in his room at the children's home. Mark knew of Michael's passion for motorbikes and used this fact to lure him. He told Michael to come and meet him to check out a new motorbike. Michael agreed and told the workers at the children's home that he was going out. The workers told Michael that it was late and that they didn't think it was a good idea to be leaving at this time. But Michael was in no obligation to stay. He could indeed come and go as he pleased. And so, Michael set off to meet Mark at 1:20 a.m. The two had planned to meet in an alleyway on the outskirts of Liverpool. But waiting for Michael was Alan, Mark, and Neil Breslin. The four walked to the park that was nearby. And once at the park, Alan began the attack. He walked right up to Michael and head-butted him, resulting in Michael falling to the ground. He then proceeded to punch, kick, and jump on Michael's head with both of his feet. At this point, Neil Breslin walked away. But Mark and Alan stripped Michael naked and threw his clothing into a puddle. Now naked, Alan began to repeatedly kick Michael in his privates and slashed his legs with broken glass. It's assumed that this was revenge for sleeping with his ex-girlfriend, and this attack lasted for some time. After this savage beating, Alan, Mark, and Neil returned to the house. During this first attack, Graham Neri stayed at Alan's home. The three returned back and spoke to Graham about the beating they had inflicted upon Michael and how they had left him naked. Shortly after returning home, they decided that they were not yet done with Michael. They decided to go back. This time, Neil didn't go, but Mark, Alan, and Graham did. The three walked towards where Michael was left, and he was still there, laying on the ground. Michael was left in a horrific condition and urgently needed medical attention. But instead of helping, the three began another vicious attack. Vicious attack. Mark shouted at Michael, demanding that he stood up at once. Otherwise, he would smash his face in. Michael tried his best to muster up the strength to get back upon his feet. But the beating he had taken was too much, and he fell back down to the ground. The three then began attacking, kicking Michael in the head, face, and genitals. They also picked up a broken bottle and began slashing and stabbing Michael. Then the three pretended that Michael's head was a football. They kept Michael's head still and took turns kicking him as hard as they could in the face and joked how they were taking penalties with his head. Alan shouted that he was a famous footballer named Michael Owen, as he took a run up to Michael and kicked him in the face. The three would also play knots and crosses on Michael's back by carving into his skin with broken glass. It seemed that the three took great joy in torturing Michael. Alan then picked up a piece of the broken glass and began hacking into the skin behind Michael's ear, in an attempt to recreate the scene from the movie they had just watched, Reservoir Dogs. Michael's ear was not removed, but Alan had made a serious attempt to do so. The totality of the two attacks lasted for nearly 2 hours. The attackers would later say that for the last 10 minutes of the attack, Michael didn't move or make a sound. After they were done, the three left the scene. At 3:31 a.m., Mark McKeefray made an anonymous phone call to the emergency services and told them that he had found a dead body and told them the location. The emergency services arrived on the scene, although they claimed that they couldn't find anybody at the location they were given. And so, the emergency services left the scene. At 7:30 a.m. on the November 13th, a person walking their dog came across the body of Michael. They made a call to the emergency services who arrived quickly at the scene. Investigators tried to identify Michael and inquired at the care home where Michael was living, as it wasn't too far from where his body was found. Michael was logged as leaving the home, but not returning. He also matched the description of the body the police had found. The police acquired a photograph of Michael and compared the image with Michael's body, hoping to make a positive identification. But Michael's injuries were so severe that they weren't even able to identify him. Michael's face had been so disfigured that they even thought the body was not that of Michael. However, a member of the children's home staff went to the scene and was able to identify the body as Michael. Meanwhile, Michael's mother Liz was at home listening to the radio when she heard the news that the body of a male had been found in a park. And then she noticed police cars pull up outside her home. Liz knew instantly why the police were there. They told her the devastating news that Michael had been killed in a horrific attack. Shortly after the discovery of Michael's body, Graham, accompanied with his mother, came into the police station to confess. Graham claimed to have felt a great deal of remorse for what had happened to Michael. He told the police what had happened and named Alan Bentley, Neil Breslin, and Mark McKeefray. Graham said that he did take part in the attack, but claimed that he only participated because he was scared that if he didn't, Alan and Mark would attack him too. He spoke to the police about how he kicked Michael in the face, not because he wanted to, but because he was filled with fear. Both Mark and Alan were arrested. It's reported that Graham did actually show signs of genuine remorse. He spoke to the police and answered every question they asked. Both Mark and Alan, however, denied even taking part in the murder. And tragically, because they refused to confess, this meant that DNA evidence had to be uncovered to build up a strong enough case against the two to make sure they were convicted. This meant that Michael's body was sent away for 5 postmortems, something that deeply affected his mother, Liz. Whilst the 4 were in custody, the police searched their homes. Inside Alan's home, they found a comic strip. The comic strip had been drawn by Alan, and it featured himself and Michael, and illustrated the murder in great detail. Michael's postmortems showed that his injuries were just beyond horrific. Both of his cheekbones had been fractured with complete separation of the nose from the facial skeleton, and fractures extending to both eye sockets. Michael had 10 broken ribs and a broken neck. There were 10 separate areas of bruising to the face and head and 50 to the body. Michael's body had 48 separate cuts from the glass and a deep gash to the back of his ear. Individually, the slashes and cuts were not deep enough to kill Michael, but the sheer amount of them caused significant blood loss. It was determined that Michael had passed away during the second attack from a broken neck. The attackers had continued to stomp and slash Michael's body even after he died. At the crime scene, the police had found the broken bottle and glass that was used on Michael. On this glass, they found fingerprints that matched with Alan, Mark, and Graham. Because the boys had stomped on Michael, they left trainer imprints on his body. These imprints were cross-referenced with their trainers, which brought up a positive result. Along with other pieces of forensic evidence, the police had enough to charge Alan, Mark, and Graham with murder, and the trial would begin in February. Before the trial, Neil accepted a guilty plea of violent disorder in regards to the first attack which he was present at, and he was not charged with murder due to him not being present in the second attack. The killers tried to make the preposterous claim that Michael had asked them to beat him up so he could claim for criminal injuries compensation and that they could all split the money. This claim was dismissed as nonsense, and the evidence found against the 3 was overwhelming. Mark, Alan, and Graham were all found guilty of murder. It said that during the trial, Graham showed signs of remorse. Mark and Alan, however, did not. Both Mark and Alan were sentenced to a minimum term of 10 years in prison, whilst Graham was sentenced to 9 years. All 3 have since been released. I'm unaware if any of them have been arrested for other crimes. I did, however, find that Neil Breslin has been convicted for other crimes. In one of these instances, Neil, along with an accomplice, tried to rob a family at knife point in their home during the night. The home belonged to an 80-year-old woman named Winfred and her 82-year-old husband. On this night, their son was also staying with them and was sleeping on the couch. Neil and his accomplice broke in and held a knife to their son and told him to remove his jewelry, although Winfred was having none of it, and she went to the kitchen and retrieved a 15-inch carving knife. It is genuinely reported that Winfred said to Neil, who was holding a 10-inch blade, "You call that a knife?" and pointed the knife at his stomach. Neil, along with his accomplice, fled from the scene. Winfred would later say, "I managed to jam the second man's foot in the door, and I threatened to put the knife through his foot. But he struggled and got away." Neil was sentenced for this crime in February 2006, and following his release, he was convicted again for smashing his girlfriend's window. The case of Michael Moss has been dubbed the Reservoir Dogs murder due to the influences the film played in the attack. It's important to say, however, that although the movie inspired some of the graphic things done to Michael, there is no link between violent movies and crime. Michael's mother, Liz, has 2 other children, and she is a grandmother. She has stated that she loves being a grandmother, but also longs for the day that she can once again be with her son. This case takes place in the United States of America on the February 14, 2017. Ellie Tran was a 35-year-old woman who lived in Virginia. She was a mother of 1 and was described as a wonderful and caring mother. Ellie had a boyfriend, a man named Joseph Vincent Molino III, who was the father of her child. Shortly after becoming pregnant with their child, Ellie told her family, who lived in Vietnam. She was a rather culturally traditional woman and wanted her parents to play a major role in her child's life, so she invited her parents to come to America and to live with her and Joseph. Joseph, however, was not so keen on this idea and made his opinions very clear. After the child was born, Joseph became incredibly controlling. Ellie's friends would later say that the couple constantly argued, especially about the living arrangements. In July of 2016, Ellie pressed charges against Joseph after he attacked her in front of their 2-year-old daughter. In the criminal complaint that was filed by Ellie, she said, "My boyfriend scared me. He told me he will put me under the ground behind the house." She also wrote about the attack, stating that Joseph had grabbed her by the neck, restrained her arms and feet, and hung her upside down with her head almost touching the ground. After describing the attack, Elle said, "He did that to me several times in front of my daughter. My daughter was so scared, and she cried and screamed." The two ended their relationship, and Ellie found a place to live with her parents and daughter. Now a single mother, Ellie began working as many hours as possible to support her daughter and parents who were looking after the child while she worked. However, due to what Joseph had done, Ellie became worried that he may come for her. One of Ellie's friends would later say that she would struggle to sleep due to the fear that Joseph may attack her in the night. Due to the breakup, a nasty custody battle ensued. Whilst Ellie would work, Joseph made several attempts to break into her new home. This resulted in Ellie having to install a number of CCTV cameras to deter him from doing so. On the December 4th at around 7 p.m., Ellie was leaving work. She got into her car and prepared to set off. But just as she did, a person backed into her car. This person then exited their vehicle, threw some kind of liquid at her, and fled. Thankfully, Eli had turned her head away at the right time. The liquid that had been thrown was acid and had begun to destroy her hair. Eli was taken to hospital, and she was not seriously harmed. The person who had done this was dressed in women's clothing and was wearing a wig. Ellie believed that this person was Joseph and had used a disguise. Eventually, Joseph found a new girlfriend. On a trip to China, Joseph met a woman and the two began a relationship. Despite this, his stalking of Ellie didn't stop, and he continued to harass her. On the February 14, 2017, Ellie finished work, got into her car, and drove to her home in Virginia Beach. CCTV footage, which was later recovered, showed her pulling up outside her house. Ellie exited her vehicle and began walking towards her door. But hidden and waiting for her to come home was Joseph. As Ellie walked towards her door, Joseph emerged from his hiding spot, ran towards Ellie, and plunged a needle into her skin. The needle was filled with cyanide. After injecting, Ellie began to scream for help. Her mother came out to help her and called the emergency services. When she came outside to assist her daughter, she looked across the street and saw who she believed to be Joseph. Ellie told the emergency services on the phone that Joseph was responsible. Within minutes of being injected by the deadly poison, Ellie lost consciousness. The paramedics soon arrived on the scene, and Ellie was rushed to hospital. The medical professionals did everything they could to try and save her. But tragically, she was pronounced dead the following day. Her cause of death was ruled as cyanide poisoning. The police began to work right away to find who had done this. Ellie's mother told the police that she believed the man who injected Ellie to be her ex-boyfriend, Joseph. And so, Joseph was brought in for questioning, and he denied having anything to do with the death of Ellie. He claimed that, on the night of the attack, he was over 100 miles away visiting family. Upon learning this, they checked out his mobile phone location. His mobile phone record showed that his phone had pinged to a tower in Victoria like he stated. However, no calls or messages were sent from the device, suggesting that he may have thought of this and left his mobile phone at this location in order to have some kind of alibi. The amount of time the phone was unused was enough time to carry out the attack. It wasn't clear if Joseph was the person in the footage. So one of the first things that the police looked at was his computer. Upon searching his devices, investigators found a number of sinister Google searches. They found all kinds of questions about cyanide, the poison that had killed Eli. How to get cyanide, how long does it take to kill, and what happens when it is injected were all searched on his device. When searching his purchase history, the police found that Joseph had bought an antique stainless steel syringe from Etsy for $68 and had it shipped to a different address. This address was a restaurant that Joseph was known to frequent. They also found that he had booked flights to China. With this evidence, Joseph was charged with the murder of Eli. 2 months before the trial began, Joseph waged a hunger strike, which resulted in him losing over 40 pounds. The trial began in 2018. The prosecution asked Joseph, "Did you kill Eli?" To which Joseph replied, "Absolutely not," sticking to the story that he was over 100 miles away at the time. When asked about the searches on the computer, Joseph denied making them or buying the syringe. He said that the computer that was used belonged to his cell phone repair business and that there were at least 6 others who had access to it, and also claimed that he had never even heard of the website Etsy. However, as I said earlier, the syringe was delivered to a restaurant that Joseph was known to go on a regular basis. A co-owner of this restaurant said he saw him walk out with a package that was delivered there. This package was the syringe. Court documents also showed that Joseph had been sending coded letters to his mother before the trial. In these coded letters, he told her to pressure the witnesses into retracting their statements. These included Elle's mother, the restaurant co-owner who saw him pick up the syringe, and one of Elle's neighbors who identified him as the attacker. He also gave instructions how to fake chat logs in order to create another alibi. Joseph also convinced other inmates to make calls for him. This inmate came forward and told the police that Joseph had confided in him and said that he was instructing people how to testify in court. In other conversations with the informant, Joseph made references to using a hitman, which he referred to as ordering a pizza. An FBI specialist testified about the letters Joseph had sent to his mother and girlfriend. He had decoded them in under 15 minutes and highlighted how Joseph had planned to get away with the crime. In one letter, Joseph wrote, "Another thing, I need you to forge some paperwork together getting someone to say they saw me on the February 14th. Joseph's alibi was checked out. Turned out he was actually visiting family. However, they could only account for seeing him on the morning and later on at night when he had supposedly finished work. Ellie's mother cried hysterically as the footage of Ellie's ambush was played for the jury. Following the footage being played, she testified that Joseph was the one responsible. It took jurors just 15 minutes to determine that Joseph was guilty. When it came time for Joseph to be sentenced, he was wheeled into court in an upright wheelchair, covered in a blanket. He was foaming at the mouth, rocking from side to side, and was unresponsive. It said that he was suffering from a condition brought on by extreme stress. Joseph was sentenced to life in prison and was fined $100,000. Early's family have said that one of the most difficult parts has been trying to answer the questions posted by Early's now 3.5-year-old daughter Jolie. Jolie witnessed her mother after the attack as she lay on the floor of her home in extreme pain. Early's sister said, "I feel heartbroken. I don't know how to answer her when she asks where her mom is. I told her that her mother is now in the sky." She went on to say that on one occasion she took Jolie to the park, but the young girl kept looking around. She said that she was looking around for her mother, waiting for her to come to the park. This case takes place in Australia on the January 12, 2016. Karen Chikuti was a 49-year-old woman who lived in Worley, Victoria. She was a mother of 2 and worked as a manager at the nearby city council. Karen was described as popular in her local community. Those who knew her thought very highly of her. On the January 12, 2016, Karen attended a local pub. She left this pub at around 7:20 p.m. Karen was divorced. She and her ex-husband had a good relationship after the divorce. The situation was described as amicable. And at this time, her 2 teenagers were staying at their father's house for the week. So she made her way home to an empty house. But this would be the last time that she was ever seen alive. Karen never showed up to work the following day. According to those who knew her, this was very out of character for her to do. Concern grew as more time passed with Karen still not showing up or responding to calls. Worley is a town 200 kilometers away from Melbourne and at the time had a population of around 360 people. With it being such a small community, the news traveled fast. And with Karen being highly respected, pretty much everyone shared the concern. The police were notified and a search was soon underway to help locate Karen. When the police went to her house, the lights had been left on and her bag and purse had been left at home. But her mobile phone was missing. But very soon after Karen's disappearance, her neighbor, Michael Cardamone, came forward to the police and told them that he had seen Karen on the January 12th at around 9 p.m. Michael had a disgusting past and had recently been released from prison in 2015. He had been found guilty of assaulting a 15-year-old girl, and at this time he was on parole for the crime. Karen wasn't overly fond of Michael for obvious reasons. She was well aware of his crimes, and he was a prolific user of illegal substances. It wasn't rare for her to find used syringes near his property among other articles. Michael told the police that Karen had come over to his place asking for some cherry tomatoes at around 9 p.m. The police checked Karen's fridge, and they did indeed find the cherry tomatoes that Michael had spoken of. Of course, the police began looking at those close to Karen. One suspect was her ex-husband, but it soon became clear to investigators that he played no part in her disappearance. The other suspect that the investigators believed could be responsible was Michael due to his strange story about Karen needing tomatoes so late at night. It was on the January 14th that evidence pointing to something sinister came to light. Her burnt-out cow was found 20 kilometers away from where she lived. An urgent search is underway after the suspicious disappearance of a mother of two in Victoria's northeast. Grave fears are held after her car was found burnt out. Crime reporter Alexis Daesh. A mother missing, her car incinerated, and her mobile phone nowhere to be found. I strongly suspect that there is someone or some others involved in this disappearance. Karen Chakutty is a mother to two teenage children and a hard-working manager at the Wangaratta Council. When she didn't turn up to work, colleagues knew something was wrong. At 5:30 p.m., she headed to her local pub just down the road from her home. She went on her own, staying until 7:30 p.m. It's the last confirmed sighting in what's now a suspicious missing persons case. On the 16th, for days after the disappearance of Karen, Michael contacted his solicitor and told them that he had been kidnapped. However, Michael was located and arrested in Ringwood, a suburb of Melbourne, on the January 17th. He told the police that he had been kidnapped by a Lebanese gang who had been targeting him and Karen. He claimed that this gang had made a number of phone calls to him stating that they would hurt him and his family, and was adamant that this gang was responsible for the disappearance of Karen. The story that Michael had told the police seemed to be too far-fetched. They didn't believe a word he was saying. Michael then told them that the kidnappers had told him where they had buried her body, but threatened him at gunpoint not to say anything about the killing. Michael then led the police on a search for Karen's body, using the directions he claimed the killers had given to him. On the January 18th, Karen's body was found off a track down Coppers Creek Road, and her body was in a truly horrific state. She had been badly beaten, her body had been run over, and she had been set on fire. An autopsy was conducted on her body. This revealed even further horror. As well as being burned alive and horrifically beaten, Karen had also been injected with amphetamines and battery acid. And once she had been killed, her body had been run over with a large vehicle. On the January 19th, Michael was charged with the murder of Karen. Since the police didn't believe Michael's first story, he decided to come up with another tall tale. As I said earlier, Karen's car was found, and it had been burned. Well, Michael had acquired help from a friend named Eddie George. George had assisted in destroying the car, but he believed he was doing it for insurance fraud. He had absolutely no idea that Michael had committed a horrendous murder. Because Eddie had assisted Michael, he tried to pin all of the blame on Eddie. He said that he was the one who had actually killed Karen. The police didn't believe this story either. But after the police spoke with Eddie, he agreed to testify against Michael in court. Michael was then made aware that Eddie was planning to testify against him. After hearing this information, Michael devised a plan to silence Eddie. In the meantime, the news of Karen's death was announced, which of course deeply disturbed the community. Karen's funeral was held in February, and literally hundreds of people attended. Whilst in remand, Michael began talking to a friend in prison. He told this fellow prisoner that he had indeed been the one who had killed Karen and went into detail about what he had done and why. He said he had wanted to sleep with Karen for a while and that he had tried building a rapport with her, but she had rejected his advances. He also told this prisoner that Eddie George had no idea about the murder and that he had tricked him into helping him dispose of Karen's car. So this is what happened to Karen. Michael went to Karen's home at 9:30 p.m. on January 2016, knowing that she would be alone. Karen was watering her vegetable garden on the night when Michael began to attack her. He was able to sedate her with horse tranquilizer and tied her up with rope and duct tape. During the next hour, he forced her to ingest a small amount of animal tranquilizer and amphetamines, and left her bound and gagged for hours in his shed. Michael then left the property and purchased some illegal substances and consumed a significant quantity, mainly meth. Michael returned in the early hours of the January 13th and dragged Karen into his car. He drove to the Lake Buffalo area, and it's here where he brutally ended Karen's life. He SAD Karen before savagely beating her. The autopsy showed that she had 6 broken ribs and a fractured skull. And at some point, Karen was also injected with battery acid. The fear and pain she must have experienced is just beyond words. But then, if that wasn't enough already, Michael doused Karen with petrol and set her alight. And the autopsy showed that she was still alive when she was set on fire. After Karen was dead, Michael got into his car and drove over her body in his 4x4 vehicle. Following this, he left her body and went to a car wash to wash his car a number of times over. At some point too, Michael also went over to Karen's home and placed the cherry tomatoes in the fridge. This was done as a way to corroborate his story that he would later tell the police. The container of tomatoes was examined by investigators. It was found that the fingerprints on the box matched with Michael's. Karen's fingerprints were nowhere to be found. After cleaning his car, Michael got help from Eddie to burn Karen's car. Upon hearing the graphic details of Karen's death, this fellow inmate that Michael had confided in spoke with the police and told them the gruesome story. And the story seemed to match up with what the autopsy report had indicated. As Michael was in jail, he spoke with his mother, and the two began plotting. Michael was able to get the details for a murder for hire whilst in jail and wanted to use their expertise to kill Eddie before the trial could take place. It was during coded conversations on the phone and in prison visits that Michael and his mother would plan. They were able to contact this hitman named Matty Thompson. Together, the mother and son worked out a plan to pay $25,000 for the hit job and used the word Naki for a code word for cash. Although little did the mother and son know that the hitman was actually an undercover officer. On the March 23, 2016, Michael's mother, Maria, handed a package with $9,000 cash to another covert operative. Michael and his mother had instructed this hitman to make it look like Eddie had taken his own life. He was told to force Eddie to create a false confession letter for the police to find, and that this letter should contain an admission of guilt that he killed Karen and that Michael had nothing to do with it. 6 days later, the undercover officer told them that the job had been done. Michael told Matty Thompson to show his mother a photograph of the body as proof that Eddie had actually been killed in the way he specified. The undercover officer then asked Michael if his mother would be able to handle seeing a photograph of a dead body. Michael replied and said that she would be absolutely fine. 2 months later, Maria was also arrested. She was charged with perverting the course of justice. Michael was also charged with the attempted murder of Eddie George. Shortly after his mother was arrested, Michael pleaded guilty to the murder of Karen. However, this was not a sign of remorse. It's believed that Michael only changed his plea to guilty to secure his mother's release. It was motivated by self-interest. The trial would begin in February 2009. Account of what happened shocked even the most seasoned officers and law officials. The judge overseeing the case stated that they had never come across a case so twisted. It said that Michael showed no signs of remorse for what he did, and this didn't go unnoticed by the judge. The prosecution stated that the crime was so cruel and so horrific that a step towards mercy or parole was too much, and that he should serve the rest of his life behind bars with no chance of parole. The judge said, "I have never declined to fix a minimum term, but this is a shocking case." The judge added that he was troubled by the fact that Michael had not provided an official reason as to why he killed Karen, nor had he shown any remorse. The prosecutor told the judge, "This crime falls into the worst category," and highlighted how Michael's chances for rehabilitation are virtually non-existent. Michael was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence handed down by the judge in August of 2017 was a landmark decision in the state of Victoria. Never before had a murderer who pleaded guilty and did not have any prior convictions for murder been denied the chance of parole. Michael's mother, Maria, who was 78 at the time, was sentenced to the 141 days that she had already served in jail since her arrest. The judge ruled that she was just another victim of his manipulation. Michael's lawyer claimed that the sentence was excessive and has since tried to appeal his sentence. Thankfully, however, Michael has been told that he has no right to appeal his sentence, and the Court of Appeal judges labeled him an unfeeling sociopath. The case of Karen is one of the cruelest I have ever come across, and it is regarded as one of Australia's most gruesome and disturbing. The fact that Michael got life in prison without the possibility of parole in